In this video, I will show you how to find where your eyes are placed on your clay positive and also how to sculpt them back into definition. Now, for most of us, our tear duct lines up with the outer edge of our nostril. And so you can see that I'm using a tool to make those little markings for the interior of my eye. And the other measurement that's pretty average for most people is that our face is 5 eyeballs wide with one width of an eyeball in between our two, so across the bridge of the nose. So if I transferred my lines from my nostril up to the inner corner of my eye and then measured that distance, that should give me the shape or the width of each of my eyes on the left and the right. Now, one thing you should know is that just off of the camera is a mirror, and I am observing the shape of my eye as I am drawing and defining it in. If you have a lot of excess clay on your portrait, you might want to consider shaving a little bit of it down, keeping in mind that the eyeball is a round circle, so a big portion of it is behind our skull, so we don't want to just make that area flat. We do want to maintain a bit of roundness. So again, I'm observing the shape of my eye in the mirror and just sketching it on. I'm using a lead pencil, mechanical pencil without the lead out, just so you can kind of see the shape a little more. But whatever tool works for you is what you should work with. Just play and experiment. So you can see that just drawing on the eyes makes it look a little freaky and a little like way too awake and alert. So even though this seems sort of counterintuitive, the best thing that you can do to really bring life and sort of dimension into the eye is actually to hollow it out, because that will create shadow, and shadow will make a better representation of your pupil or your iris than drawing it on. And so I still have a lot of work to do, but this is sort of taking the general idea and moving it forward. You want to think about the big picture here. You want to not fuss and define one particular part too much. It's a game of back and forth. So if the clay is a little bit too plastic, or not too plastic, if the clay is plastic, it will shape really well, but it will leave ridges when I carve and cut and sharp edges. So then I might have to get it to more of a leather soft state in order to get a little bit more definition in, and maybe even wait till that leather hard state to really get the full definition that I want. So there's a lot of back and forth that happens here. And this demo occurs over the course of about, I don't know, 2 hours from start to finish. So again, patience will be the key. So you can see on the left, I did just a slightly different variation of the eye. I sunk in the iris one layer and then made a dot for the pupil. Look online, there are so many different ways that people approach sculpting eyes. This is the most basic, is just taking that round tip of your loop tool and carving out the iris. So one thing I just want to show you here close up is, again, clay is beautiful and plastic, and when I say that you can compress it to create shape and change, you can see here that with my popsicle stick and my point, I am compressing the clay, I'm just pushing it, and I'm making a rounded shape. And you could make an eyeball in theory just by taking clay, if it's soft enough, and compressing it. Again, that's one of the great things about clay. You can add, subtract, compress, move, smoosh, all those good things. So I took a little piece of clay, I rolled a coil. You can see that I put a little bit of water on my workboard so that as I rolled out the coil, it didn't dry out. And I am laying it over the top of my upper lid. I'm going to make this coil a little smaller for the lower lid. We're not going for like paper thin here. We actually do want a little bit more clay to define the upper and lower lid. It's okay to slightly exaggerate features when you are sculpting because again, it's about light and shadow. And once I feel I have that in place, I can cut off the excess little coil. I can use my needle tool or the tip of a pencil to adjust it. You can open it up more, you can close it a little bit more, you can play with your expression. So the next thing I'm going to do is take the back of my wooden tool and I'm going to use that to blend that coil into the eye. Because my clay is still fairly plastic, I didn't need to worry about scoring and slipping, which would have just kind of made a bit of a mess in that area. It's so small to work with, and I'm really joining these two pieces of clay together through the action of using my wooden tool to smooth. So I feel pretty confident that that will stay. So again, just play with your tools. What's going to work good? The back end of a paintbrush, a wooden popsicle stick that you've shaved down, the back of your fingernail, your pinky. What is it that works for you? Again, I also like to use a paintbrush as a sculpting tool. There's not a lot of water on it, just a little, but that helps me shift it and move it. So now I'm making a little progress. You can see that I'm catching a little more light and shadow on the right eye compared to the left. So I added a little, the coils to the left eye. As I said, I kind of like to not just obsess about one eye or one facial feature, but move my way around. And I continue to make sure that the rest of the clay isn't too dry. And if it is, I can add a little moisture or cover it in plastic. So we're getting a little closer. Got a little extra clay up in that corner. So find whatever tool works to kind of sharpen up those edges. Again, you might find that you like sculpting with the clay when it's really soft and plastic. You might prefer the leather soft stage, or you might actually prefer it when it's more leather hard and you can sort of scrape away and remove material and work with compression. So the best thing that you can do is just experiment. And if you don't like the way something is working, especially if it's not doing what you want it to do, you might just want to stop and let it stiffen up a little bit and come back to it. Clay, as I keep saying as well, requires a lot of patience. It's not usually something we do in one sitting. It often needs a little bit of a rest in between the different stages. So I wanted to give my upper lid a little definition, and you can see I kind of traced it with a more distinct tool and then took my brush in there to soften it up. I'm going to add my little furrowed brows and also some eyebrows. And there are so many different ways people approach this. Some people are much more subtle and they're just sort of creating a little definition by scratching in. I like to add a little coil so that I have a little bit of dimension, a little more dimension. And in this particular instance, I am scoring and slipping to adhere it. So I'm building up slip with my paintbrush, scoring it with my needle tool. Now that looks a little cartoony, so I can smooth those layers in together. And then through just a combination of playing with a needle tool, a toothbrush, and even my fingernails, I can add a little bit of definition back into this. I did realize that the brow that I added felt a little thick, a little extreme, and so I also used my loop tool to shave it back just a little bit. Maybe compression could also work. And I draw lines in, kind of texture, I should say, when it's a little bit wet, and then I let it stiffen up and come back with a paintbrush or a toothbrush and kind of soften up those edges. So hair textures are definitely sort of a back and forth. So those needle tool lines felt a little sharp, so I used the toothbrush, and then the toothbrush took too much away, and so I went back. And ultimately, I think the clay was just a little bit too sticky, too plastic as I was working with it. And so it might have been good to wait a little bit before I messed around with it too much. So I'm getting close to the end of this particular session of working with it. I didn't realize at the time just how intense those eyebrows looked. The one on the left, I was letting it stiffen up a little bit so I could soften, but I've since then come back in and defined those eyebrows a little less so they're not quite as intense. Can take my paintbrush and clean up a little bit of the face just to kind of smooth things out. You could even take a sponge and add a little bit of texture back into it. But again, as a reminder, when you are nearing the end of your session, you want to assess whether your clay is at a stage where you like it. And if it is, cover it really well in plastic if you want to keep coming back to work. If it feels a little stiff, you might want to add just a little bit of moisture to it. At this stage, if you have definition in your face, you don't really want to take a sponge and directly use the sponge on the face. You might want to take a spray mister. You also could put a damp sponge inside of the plastic bag next to your face, not on your face, and that will act as a moisture chamber to kind of hold the clay in place. This is just me wiping dry clay off of my workboard to try to keep dust down. And if you do decide that you're all done, you could loosely cover it in plastic so you see that I'm letting more air in around the face, and I wouldn't seal it around the edge of the board. And that would be a good thing to do for a day or maybe even two to kind of slow down the drying process to make sure that it dries evenly. But if you do want to come back and work with it, then seal it up underneath all of the sides. And again, don't forget about proper and safe cleanup. We don't want to make dust, and so I'm just carefully moving my tools out of the way. Because I have newspaper down, I can gather up the dust in a little channel and throw that away. Or since it's newspaper, I can just fold it up and put it in my compost. The final step would be a damp sponge and water to wipe the table.